What's going on, guys? So tonight I want to do something a little bit different. I want to go over a best commons list, at least from my perspective. I know others are going to have some different opinions on what they feel are some of the best commons in the game, but this is my personal list from my experience. So we'll just leave it at that. I know I'm not the end all be all here, but I'm just going to show you some of my favorite commons and, again, what I deem as some of the best. So let's take a look at my list. I just made it into a deck, so there are a few more I wanted to add that I just ran out of room for this, so it's fine. I mean, these are some of the top ones here that, like I said, I think are some of the best. So we'll just start at the top, and I'm not going to do any play on this video. It's going to be a nice short video. I'll probably also do later on. I'll probably put out some other best, rare lists or best epics, best legendary. Just kind of, looking for some different type of content. And if you guys like these kind of videos, we can keep doing them. And if not, just let me know. Hey, I didn't really care for that. And, I won't do any more of these if you guys just want to see gameplay and such. But I figured this is kind of a neat list, especially since beginners are always asking, hey, what's some good playable cards, for me? And I don't have a lot of cards in my collection right now. What can I use in place of this or in place of that? So I think this is a good way to introduce some cards that maybe people didn't think about or never understood why certain things could be good, or different decks that it could be viable in versus decks where you probably wouldn't play these type of cards, because everything has its niche, right? There's certain cards on this list that are obviously going to be better in certain decks, whereas some of them are just good in, most decks, or in a vacuum, the card is good by itself, whereas some of these on the list might require additional card to be added for it to be playable. So I'll talk about that as we get to some of those cards that I'm referring to. But for starters, we'll start off at the top here. Aki and Saltfish. Oh, and also before I get started, now this is just common base level. This is not limited commons. So I'll probably do a later video on once we get into limited cards. But for now, these are just base level cards. There's no limited cards within this. So again, starting at Aki and Saltfish. This card is good in a Cuisine deck. There's a lot of cards that buff Cuisine cards. And it does start out as a 0 power card. But like I said, there's a lot of cards that can buff this before it gets played. So a lot of times, if it's in a nice Cuisine build, this card is not, as the first time you play it, it's not going to be, most likely not going to be a 0 power card. And then once it is returned, the next one, possibly 2 times you play it, this card can hit pretty big. So for only 4 energy, the second time you play it, you're already hitting for 70, and then potentially 140 or higher when you have all these Cuisine cards buffing it. So I think it's a decent card to include in Cuisine. Again, in a vacuum, the card is playable. I think it's going to be obviously a lot better in either decks that buff other cards up. So maybe if you included this in something with Martin Luther King or Napoleon Bonaparte, something that can buff these types of cards that are 4 or less. CubeSats comes to mind. I think there's some other good buffing cards. So I think that card has the potential, especially towards the later game, to be a heavy hitter for only 4 energy. So I'm looking at value. For a lot of these cards are, they're not super high impactful cards, but they're value cards. They're cards that for X amount of energy, what am I going to get the most value out of for that energy I'm spending? So that's the way I'm looking at this deck, or these cards I've picked. So for 4 energy, I think that is a good choice. Next card on the list is Peter Paul Rubens. Now, this card is deceptive at first glance because you're paying 5 energy for only 8 power as the base stat. But then we have the return effect where if you're going to gain 8 permanently. So if you played this on turn 1, that would be 14 turns that you could potentially get 8 additional permanent power. So what is that? That's like 112, I think. 112 power for, and then plus the 8, so really 120 total, and that's only for 5 energy. Now that's just playing at one time. Obviously, if you play it, in round 3, it's going to be, how much more are you going to get out of that? Maybe another, what's that? Trying to think how many turns that is. Maybe another 8 turns, let's say. So another 8 plus, so 64 power on top of that. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, especially the earlier you play this card. So again, it's good in that type of build where you're looking to build up power per turn, they call it. So PPT decks. You're looking to drop these cards that are giving you a lot of permanent power buffs that the more you play, as the turns go later and later and later, or the rounds go later, you are going to get more and more free power at the start of every turn. So that's why I've included that card. Moving on, we've got Iconic Column. So only 3 energy cost, and it's going to give you 7 base power. But now this is going to be obviously a caveat for this card, is it's good only really with Ancient Greece cards. But if you built an entire deck based around Ancient Greece cards, that is quite a bit of power you're going to get for a 3 energy card. So again, in a vacuum, not the greatest, but in a build built around Ancient Greece cards, there's 18 cards in your deck. You can buff, they each get plus 10 until played. It's 187 power counting its base stats for 3 energy. So that's tough to beat in a all Greece type deck. So that's why I included it, just because the sheer power it can get. I know it's situational with the caveat, but still very good if played properly in the right type of deck. So next up is Ramses 2. And this card, when played, it's going to buff your Ancient Egypt and Egyptian mythology cards plus 10 this turn. Doesn't seem like much, but there is a card out there, Tutankhamun, that gives this card a really nice buff. So it's good in that combo Ancient Egyptian shell. It's one of the staples, I believe, in that deck. So that's why I've included it. Again, in a vacuum by itself, obviously stats aren't that great. Only 4 energy for 25 with 25 base power, and the buff it gets also would require other cards to make it good, but that's okay. Most of the times you are only going to play this card in an Egyptian build. So again, situational, but I think for what it is and what deck it's in, it's a powerhouse card in that specific deck. So again, that's why I've included it. Grand Architect, I think, is a really good 1-drop. And when played, your arts and culture and history cards in hand all gain plus 10 this turn. So doesn't seem like much, but obviously you're going to play it with a deck primarily of history or arts and culture cards is when I usually slot this card in. And if it's a low energy week, or if I'm playing it in a casual type brew, it's a good inclusion. Again, only 1 energy, you're going to get that. Typically you'll play it and you're going to try to get the full benefit out of it. So 31 power for only 1 energy. Also can be good in a lot of buff decks or decks like Binary, those tiny decks that are going to give you, buffing all your little cards like these 1-drops. Get a lot of value from those types of Frilled Dragon or Binary type builds. But obviously you have to include the arts and culture and history to get the full benefit out of it. But can be a good card. Next up, I've included Micro Dot. Very similar reasons. Again, there's a lot of tiny decks that like these 1-drop cards. A lot of cards that buff real small 1-drop cards like these. And this one, no exception. Very similar to the last card we showed, but can do it by itself when played. Gain plus 10 power this round. So obviously you want to play it on turn 1, and you will get the full 31 power for only 1 energy. So not too bad. I like to look at things on a on a scale of 10. So for every 1 energy minimum, I need to get 10 power. And that's a minimum. So anything that's better than that is what I'm looking at. So if I'm spending, 5 energy, I need obviously 50 power or more. Typically, I want to obviously lean towards the more side. So the higher difference I can get from that 50 for that 5 energy example is the better the card. So in this example with the microdot, I'm only spending 1 energy, but I'm getting 31 power in return when played on turn 1. So pretty good. It's, I think it's decent, especially in a low energy week. Next up we have is dead drops. When drawn, a random card in your hand gains plus 50 power this turn, and this card loses 50 this turn. So obviously when you draw it, you're not going to play it. You're going to wait and hold it one more turn and play it on the next turn. So really it's going to give you, for 7 energy, you're getting what's 70 plus 50, whatever. Can't do math right now, but was that 120, 130, something like that? So pretty good stats for only 7 energy. And for obviously a higher energy week, that's going to be a pretty big hitter if you're looking for a nice common card to include. So 120 power, like I said, for 7 energy. Not too shabby. Shiba Inu, next one up. Included this kind of an interesting ability on it, really, is what I'm after. So reason I say that is a lot of times in my decks, I like to have at least one card that is just kind of sitting in my hand. So I don't really necessarily need to play it. I just want it taking up a slot and doing something while it's sitting there. And that's what this card does, right? So when I draw it, I'm getting a ability +6 now for the rest of the game until I return this to my deck. So I draw it, I let it just sit in my hand. Yes, it takes up a slot. That's fine. Typically, I have no problem playing around a 4-card hand with a dead card like this in my hand. Sometimes I'll play it out in a pinch if I really need to, but the main purpose that I would include this would be to give my deck that little extra something. Obviously, again, taking up a slot in my hand, but that's fine. I would just draw it, sit on it for a while, and get the benefit off of this 6 every turn. So if you think of it like, we go 15 rounds, and I drew this on turn 1, 15 times 6, whatever you get out of that. That's a lot of free power just for a card to just hang out in your hand all game, and then you could, if you wanted to, play it on the very last turn of the game or whatever. It's kind of how I view that card, is just you're getting free power just letting it hang out in a slot. So that's why I've included it. I think that's a neat effect. There's a lot of other cards in the game that do that with start abilities, but most of them aren't at the common slot level. So for a common, I think this is the card that does that probably the best in the common slot. Next up we have is Dandelion. Again, you guys see a trend here. I have a lot of very cheap cards on this list because I think cheap cards are playable, especially in casual mode or in low energy weeks when you have a chance to win with these common cards. A lot of times you can slot these cheap cards in like this, especially in binary builds, like I said earlier, frilled dragon builds, and really take advantage of players if you don't have the best cards and you're just looking for, cards that you can sub in place of other cards that you might be lacking. So this is a good one. Again, when drawn, you get +18 on the turn and only 1 energy. So guaranteed to get that +28. You don't have to, unlike some of these other cards like Microdot where you're trying to play around when you play the card. This card is just immediate. When you draw it, you get the +18 on the turn. So you're always going to get that 28 no matter what. Whereas Microdot, again, situational. You have to play it on turn 1 to get the full benefit off of it. Sometimes that might not happen, right? So there's the downside of a Microdot, and then the downside of Dandelion. Obviously, doesn't have the as high of a potential, but doesn't have to be situational either. So that's why I've included it. This card, you guys probably seen a lot of my videos. I like this card a lot. Celebrocious, however you say it. I think it's like a little mini Rat King, personally. It buffs your hand, and it's permanent buff, which I love. So for only 2 energy, so great in a nice cheap deck built around, again, like binary or something like that, or a low energy weak. You can draw this card. It loses 8 permanently, and your other cards in hand get a buff of +6. So you're going to get, if you're sitting on 4 other cards in your hand, they're all going to get buffed. You're going to get 24 power back and lose, 8. So, but a lot of times this card's going to get buffed by other cards in your deck anyway. So you're not going to notice, I think you're not going to really notice that -8 off the card. You're just going to notice your other cards getting buffed more than anything. So fantastic common card. Again, I had it in a lot of my decks just because I think it's just that good, to be honest. Even if it is just for casual play or low energy weeks, I think the card is still a viable card. To me, it might be one of the better cards on the list, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the top commons, at least in my opinion, just because the ability is that strong. There's so many decks that want permanent buffs. It's just tough to beat. All right, moving on, we've got playing cards. Again, nice 1-drop card. When played, if you're losing the round, your cards in hand gain +10 this turn. So, again, for only 1 energy, you can get that 31 power. Again, it's kind of situational, but most of the time you're only going to play it when you are losing the round, right? So a lot of cards combo with it. I want to say there's a couple cards combo with playing cards specifically that buff it. Can't think of the name of the cards off the top of my head. I want to say it's like Tuxedo or something like that, or Suit, one of them kind of cards. Specifically buffs playing cards. And again, nice 1-drop, so there's a lot of other cards, Frilled Dragons, binaries, that buff it up. So I did a nice video a while back on like a real cheap budget deck, and I included that in the build, and it played really nice. I mean, I think I was dropping it for like 100 power for 1 energy. It was just getting buffed up so good. So just a card I've grown to like, and playing with it in the couple times I've played and built decks with it, I think it's pretty good. Next up, I've got Sodium. This is kind of a specific deck again. For those of you that like the energy drain decks or stealing your opponent's energy type decks, I think this is a good, or not, I shouldn't say great or anything, but it's a decent card to include for that type of build if you're lacking some of the higher end, more impactful cards for that archetype. I think this is an easy one to slot in place and still get that stealing energy from your opponent. Now, it is situational. You have to win the turn. So you are going to want to play it, certain scenarios when you think you can win the turn. But when you do, it is nice to get that, steal off of the energy. So, and you still get 34 power off of it too, which is nice. Obviously, you're not getting that full 40 like I would like, but in this case, just the fact that you're getting to steal energy from your opponent, I think it can be worth it in the right build, especially on that drain deck. It's a good substitute for some of the other cards if you don't have them. Next up, I've got Height. Now, obviously, there's several cards within this Sue Bones deck that are at the common slot. I just chose one and just threw it in. I actually chose the cheapest energy cost card. I don't think it matters. I think they're all pretty much the same. If you're going to have one, you're probably going to have them all. So we went and tossed one in. I know there's a lot of players out there that like the Sue Bones deck archetype. It can be very good, especially in high energy weeks where you're not struggling for energy, because a lot of these cards are very expensive is the downside. So, but when played, your Sue Blacks in Bones cards, wherever they are, gain +3 until played. So all these cards buff up all the other cards within that Sue Bones archetype. So you'll see. And then when played, if you have Age Estimation in this game, your Ancestral Origin card gains +8 until turn. So just all these buffs that these cards put off on each other is what I'm looking at. Just sheer value for what you're getting, you know what I mean? So that's why we've included that. Next up, I have Water Strider. So for 3 energy, you're going to get that 20 raw stat. Now, the ability can also be situational, but if you build, a straight ocean and seas type deck, which is not uncommon, let's say like a Penguins build or something, you slot this card in, you can get your oceans and seas cards in hands all gain plus 10 this turn. So for 3 energy, you're minimum getting that 50 power, but you also have the chance, if your opponent's playing oceans and seas cards, you can knock them 10 this turn as well. So you could potentially, on its best play, you could spend 3 energy and potentially have an 80 impact power, subtracting 30 from your opponent. You're gaining 30, and it has 20 on the base stat. So not too bad for 3 energy. I know we talked about some cards above that were a little more impactful at the 3 slot, but still not the worst, Definitely an option, especially if you're in an oceans and seas build. Next up, I'm going to talk about Scale Worm. Actually, one of my recent videos, I had this card in, and this seems very good. Very impactful card. When played, all cards in both players' hands with 50 or more base power lose 30 this turn. So you have a deck built around cheaper cards, and you're not including a lot of high-cost cards. You play this card out on that turn with some cheaper cards in your hand, like cheaper as in cheaper power level, under 50. Your opponent, obviously you're guessing if you're hoping your opponent plays out cards over 50, but this card can be a pretty big swing. I think one of my videos I saw it hit all 3 of my opponent's cards on the turn I played it. So, basically digging him 90 power that turn. So for 5 energy, I'm getting 90 plus 37 back. So at the max. So that's pretty good. Obviously that's best case scenario, but for a best case scenario, it's pretty high power level. So if you play this in a week where everybody's playing big expensive cards on a high cost week, for a good debuff strategy, this could be a good option. Next up, we have Dwarf, Pluto Dwarf Planet. Now I've included this by itself in a vacuum. Not the greatest card you guys can see. 7 energy for only 57 power, but there is a card out there, and it's, I want to say, just an epic card. I think it's Chiron or something like that, that specifically buffs Pluto, and it also makes it 7 energy cheaper. So you can basically play this card, and I think it's when Chiron is drawn. So you don't have to play that card. I think it's just when it's drawn, this card, wherever it is, gets a 7 energy discount and a buff. So makes it pretty strong for, again, there's a combo. So you have to have the other card to make it good. But when you do, it is fairly strong. So that's the reason I've included it on the list. After this, I finish these last 2, I'll run over to the other list, all cards, and I'll show you the card I'm talking about that combos really well with it, just so you guys understand what I'm kind of getting at. But let's look at the rest of the cards, and we'll kind of go back to that one. So next up, Mars Rover Curiosity. Again, a specific type of deck it's looking for. It's wanting a space-themed deck with space technology cards in hand. Your cards all gain plus 15 until played, but if you build a deck around a lot of those cards, again, for 1 energy, you can get a very impactful turn with just this one card here, buffing everything 15. So pretty strong, again, built around space technology cards. Last card on the list is Lunar Module Eagle. Again, specific to the Apollo 11 deck, but most likely an auto-include in that deck. So if you do play Apollo 11, this card for only 4 energy, you're going to get 72 power. So pretty good. It's going to buff the Apollo 11 card, 36. So you'll see 36 plus 36 for 4 energy. So pretty good stats for only 4 energy. So let's go back and look at now what I was talking about with this Pluto card real quick, and then we're going to end the video there. So let me go all cards, type in Pluto. So here's the card, Chiron. So it's a 9 energy epic card. When drawn, your Pluto card, wherever it is, gains plus 23 and costs minus 7. So basically, if you played both these cards at the same time, what's that? 23 plus 57, what is that, 80? So 80 energy or 80 power for 0 for Pluto, and then a 9 drop for 87. So you basically, for 9 energy, you're getting 167 power. So pretty strong. So that's why I mentioned Pluto, because of this card here. So again, in a vacuum by itself, not the greatest card, obviously. So if you are going to play this card, you want to have this card too. It's the only way to make it viable in that type of deck. So just keep that in mind. Again, not by itself. So, all right. That's the video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the list. You guys can feel free to, comment if I missed some cards. Obviously, this is an opinion-based list. I'm not the greatest player out there. I'll be the first to say. But in my, the cards I've played and the cards I've got a chance to build decks around are the ones I've included here. And I think, from my experience, they're the ones that have impressed me the most. So if you guys disagree, that's fine. You guys are welcome to shoot me comments and say, no, how did you miss this card? Maybe I haven't played it. I might be a card I need to go back and take a look at and reevaluate myself and say, wow, that card is really good. How did I not see that? But for now, I'm happy with my list, and I hope you guys are too. So thanks for watching. Have a good night.